Have you ever noticed how a man can joke about death, but not about growing old? He'll laugh at the thought of dying, fantasize about going out in a blaze of glory, even make peace with the end as if it's noble. But mention his fading relevance, his softening frame, the way younger men start calling him sir, and suddenly the room gets quieter. There's a shadow behind every wrinkle he tries not to see. A deeper fear than death, not extinction, but erosion. Not finality, but the long, slow dismantling of the self he once built his entire identity around. Carl Jung, in his characteristically unflinching way, saw this fear not as vanity or midlife melodrama, but as the psyche's reckoning with its own shadow, the shadow of decline. It isn't about the fear of losing hair or speed or strength, not really. It's the fear of becoming invisible, useless, exiled from the currency of youth, vitality, conquest. For a man, especially one who has spent decades measuring himself by what he can do, achieve, endure, dominate, aging feels like a theft, a quiet daily robbery of what once made him feel alive. And perhaps worse, what made him feel worthy of love, attention, and respect. You don't have to be old to feel it. The fear starts early. It shows up in the gym mirror when you skip a workout and see softness creeping in. It whispers in your chest when a younger coworker gets the spotlight. It roars in silence when you realize that no matter how much you've built, time is building something else, your exit. Even success doesn't shield you. In fact, Jung would argue success amplifies the terror, because the higher your tower, the more profound the vertigo when it starts to sway. What most men don't realize is that this fear is not weakness, it's not irrational, it's not shameful, it's archetypal. The fear of aging is a coded message from the unconscious, an alarm bell from the soul that says you've been living in only half of yourself. And aging is the moment the other half starts knocking. You see, the first half of life is the stage of expansion, ego, ambition, assertion. It's when a man learns to climb professionally, physically, socially, he becomes something. But Jung warned that if you keep climbing forever, you'll eventually find yourself standing on a crumbling peak with no idea how to descend. Because the second half of life is not about conquest, it's about return, about integration, about what Jung called individuation, the slow, difficult, beautiful process of becoming whole. But here's the problem. Most men don't know how to do this. They've spent their lives mastering the outer world. They built identities out of being competent, admired, needed. But when those scaffolds start to fall, and they will, what's left underneath? If a man has never explored his inner world, aging feels like exile, like banishment from the empire he built with his own hands. And so he resists. He fights the descent. He clings to youth not because he wants to party again or relive his 20s, but because he doesn't yet know who he is without youth, without being the strongest in the room, without being desired, without being relevant. And yet, resisting aging is like resisting sunset. The more you rage against it, the more ridiculous you look. The fear that burns under the surface isn't really about being old, it's about being forgotten. It's about realizing that maybe your name won't echo, that your body is no longer your badge of worth, that one day soon, no one will ask you to lead.
Jung saw this not as a personal failing, but as a cultural illness. A society obsessed with youth is a society at war with its own unconscious. We praise beginnings and mock endings. We elevate the rise and ignore the descent. But what if the descent isn't defeat? What if aging isn't collapse, but transformation? What if the fall is the beginning of depth? The man who fears aging is not a coward. He is a man standing at the edge of himself, staring down into the unknown. He is watching the symbols of his worth, strength, sex, ambition begin to fade. But this is not the end of the story. Jung believed that if a man can face the shadow of decline without flinching, if he can let go of the outer mask and turn inward, something astonishing happens. Not death, not decay, but rebirth. He becomes something else, someone deeper, quieter, freer.
But here's the thing no one tells you. This descent into aging, into decline, into the terrifying stripping away of your former self, it is not graceful, it is violent, it is grief. The man who once commanded a room now feels himself become the furniture. The confident stride is replaced with careful steps. Former lovers look through him like a window. Opportunities dry up. His stories, once thrilling, now seem long-winded. And somewhere in the silence of all of that invisibility, something shatters. That shattering, Jung would say, is not the end. It's the cracking of the ego's outer shell. The false self that believed it was the sum of accomplishments and charm. But men are rarely prepared for this, because no one teaches them how to die before they die. No one tells them that the second half of life is a kind of inner death, not a punishment, but a rite, a holy unraveling. And this is where the real crisis begins. Because when the masculine psyche, trained only for war and work and reward, meets the soft chaos of inner life, it panics. There's nothing to win there, no ladder to climb, just darkness, memory, regret, tenderness, mystery, and silence. And men are terrified of silence. Not the silence around them, the silence within. Because in that silence live the pieces of himself he never learned to carry. The boy who still feels abandoned, the rage he swallowed for the sake of peace, the years he ignored his own heart, the women he never truly saw, the moments of cowardice, cruelty, weakness buried so deep they became ghosts. This is the shadow Jung spoke of, and it is not abstract, it is feral, specific, and personal. And when a man begins to age, when his outer power starts to dim, the shadow steps forward, not to haunt him, but to be seen. And integration hurts. It is a kind of spiritual surgery, bloodless but not painful. Jung knew that unless a man faces the shadow willingly, it will sabotage him. It will leak through his relationships, his addictions, his cynicism, his cruelty, and in old age it will become bitterness. The sharp, hollow laugh of someone who has never met himself.
This is why so many men grow old in regret. Not because life was cruel, but because they missed their own depths. They confused growth with accumulation. They never surrendered. They mistook aging for dying and never discovered what was being born. But it doesn't have to be this way. Jung believed that the second half of life, while often darker, is also more sacred. Because the man who walks this path, the path of descent, of softening, of internal reckoning, does not become less, he becomes real. No longer driven by proving, he becomes presence. He no longer clings to certainty, so he becomes wise. He no longer needs to dominate, so he becomes magnetic. He listens more. He speaks less. He sees through things, people, lies, performances, and forgives them. Not because he's weak, but because he finally understands. He carries a calm that can't be faked because he's no longer trying. He knows his soul now because he's walked through hell to meet it. He doesn't fear death anymore because he's already died once. The day he stopped being who the world expected and began becoming who he actually is. This is what the world misses when it sees aging as decline. This is what we rob ourselves of when we numb the transition, when we refuse the silence, when we refuse the shadow. The aging man is not useless. He is becoming whole, but only if he allows himself to descend, not fall, descend, with eyes open, with dignity, with the courage to stop grasping at what was and start listening to what wants to emerge.
And now, here you are, perhaps already descending, or perhaps just beginning to loosen your grip on the life you've spent so long building. And something inside you knows this isn't defeat. Not really. It feels like defeat because no one has shown you the map. They've told you how to climb, not how to land. But the descent is not chaos. It's the path toward what Jung called the self, the deeper, truer center of who you are, beyond identity, beyond ambition, beyond even your name. To reach this self, though, the ego must surrender its throne, and that terrifies most men, because the ego is loud, and the self is quiet. The ego wants admiration, the self wants truth. The ego wants control, the self wants wholeness, but wholeness, Jung warned, requires embracing everything you've tried to outrun. The wounded child, the discarded dreams, the helplessness you buried beneath competence, the rage you tucked under politeness, the fear you masked as sarcasm. This is the terrain of aging, not decline, but revelation, not weakness, but initiation. You are not becoming less of a man. You're being invited to become all of one. The kind of man who doesn't need applause because he's finally learned how to sit with silence. The kind of man who doesn't flinch at pain because he's walked through it and stayed. The kind of man who doesn't chase relevance because he has become rooted in something eternal, his own soul. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But most men never do. They die as the role they played, the provider, the leader, the protector, the performer. All useful, but none complete. The world doesn't need more roles. It needs more presence, more stillness, more elderhood. Not in title, but in essence. And so the man who fears aging more than death is not vain. He is close, closer than most, closer to transformation, closer to the part of himself that cannot be taken, outpaced, or ignored. And he is right to be afraid, not of the loss, but of what it demands. Everything, every illusion, every mask, every false refuge.
But on the other side of that surrender is something fierce and quiet, something utterly unshakable. The man who integrates his shadow does not just survive aging, he transcends it. He becomes dangerous again, not in the way of conquest, but in the way of silence, the way of clarity, the way of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to give. And that is why Jung did not romanticize youth. He respected the fire of it, yes, but he bowed to the man who had walked through his own darkness and came back with light in his eyes. Because that man can no longer be manipulated, not by praise, not by fear, not even by time. So perhaps the question isn't, how do I avoid decline? But what is aging trying to give me that I couldn't hear until now? What is this slow unraveling making room for? What beauty, what depth, what truth has been waiting behind the noise of youth, behind the identity of success? Because the end of one power is the birth of another. And in the silence of your descent, something eternal is calling you, not to fade, but to arrive.